In the spring of 1900, a storm changed everything. A small boat full of sponge divers from the Greek island of Symi was making its way to Tunisia when the weather turned. They sheltered at a tiny island called Antikythera, barely more than a rock in the strait between Crete and the Greek mainland. When the storm passed, they decided to dive. There was no particular reason to expect anything. They were looking for sponges. One diver, Elias Stadiatis, went down to about 45 meters. He came back up and told the captain he had found a heap of dead, naked people on the seabed. They were marble statues. The divers had stumbled onto one of the greatest archaeological finds of the ancient world, a Roman cargo ship, lost approximately 60 BCE, carrying a spectacular load of Greek treasure. Bronze statues, marble sculptures, jewelry, glassware, pottery. And, almost unnoticed in the wreckage, a lump. A corroded, unassuming lump of bronze and rotted wood, roughly the size of a large book, that barely attracted attention when it was pulled from the sea in 1901. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens for a year before anyone looked at it carefully. When they did, they found a gear. And that gear turned out to be the first visible piece of something that would take the next 100 years to partially understand, a device so far ahead of its time that historians of technology still struggle to fully explain how it existed. This is the story of the Antikythera Mechanism. Hi guys, welcome back. So I want to start with a specific thing I need you to hold in your mind as we go through this. Because this is not a story about alien technology or ancient conspiracies or any of that. It's more unsettling than that. This is a story about human beings being astonishingly brilliant, and about what it means when we discover that a civilization was doing something we thought we invented, in a time we assumed was impossible. The Antikythera Mechanism is the oldest known complex geared device in the world. It was built somewhere around 150 to 100 BCE, with some scholars arguing it might date to as early as 205 BCE. It is a hand-cranked mechanical computer made of bronze. It could predict solar and lunar eclipses. It tracked the movements of the sun and moon. It modeled the positions of the 5 planets known to the ancient world. It calculated the timing of the Olympic Games. It incorporated multiple astronomical cycles simultaneously, including one that tracked the 19-year relationship between the lunar and solar calendars, and another that predicted eclipses across an 18-year cycle. And it did all of this with interlocking bronze gears, the teeth of which are approximately 1 millimeter long. Nothing of comparable mechanical sophistication appears anywhere in the archaeological record for roughly the next 1,400 years. Not close. Not approximately. The next devices anywhere near this level of mechanical complexity are medieval European astronomical clocks. And those clocks are more than 1,000 years later. That gap. That specific, documented, inexplicable gap. That is what I want to talk about today. Let me take you back to the context. Greece, the Hellenistic period, roughly 100 BCE. The world of the Antikythera Mechanism is not the Athens of Plato and Socrates, which was 300 years earlier. This is a later, more sophisticated, more internationally connected world. The campaigns of Alexander the Great had, by this point, spread Greek culture and Greek knowledge across a vast swath of the ancient world, from Egypt to the edges of India. The result was an extraordinary flowering of scientific thought. Alexandria had its great library. Greek mathematicians and astronomers were making discoveries of staggering precision. Hipparchus of Rhodes is the figure most frequently associated with the astronomical theory that the mechanism encodes. Hipparchus, who worked on the island of Rhodes in the 2nd century BCE, was possibly the greatest astronomer of the ancient world. He had calculated the length of the lunar month to within 1 second of the modern value. He had mapped thousands of stars. He had discovered the precession of the equinoxes. He had developed mathematical models for the irregular motion of the moon, the fact that the moon does not move at a constant speed in its orbit, but speeds up and slows down, with extraordinary accuracy. The Antikythera mechanism encodes Hipparchus's lunar theory in its gears. This is not metaphorical. There is a physical mechanism inside the device, called a pin and slot mechanism, that models the moon's variable speed with mechanical precision. A pin eccentric to a gear's center engages a slot in the gear above it, causing the upper gear to speed up and slow down as the pin moves through the slot. The varying angular velocity this produces matches the moon's actual behavior in its orbit. Someone took Hipparchus's mathematical calculations and built them into a machine. Not wrote them down. Not described them. Built them. In bronze. By hand. Into a device the size of a shoebox. Now let me tell you what this thing actually looked like. The Antikythera mechanism, in its original state, was housed in a wooden case approximately 34 cm by 18 cm by 9 cm, roughly the size of a shoebox, or a large hardback book. The front of the case had a large dial showing the position of the sun and moon through the zodiac, and the phases of the moon. The back of the case had two large spiral dials, one above, one below. The upper back dial tracked the metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which the phases of the moon fall on the same calendar dates again. This spiral was divided into 235 sections, one for each lunar month in the 19-year cycle, and a pointer traveled around it, telling the user where they were in this vast calendrical rhythm. The lower back dial tracked the Saros cycle, the 18-year, 11-day period after which eclipses repeat in the same pattern. This spiral was divided into 223 sections, one for each lunar month in the Saros period. On specific sections, tiny inscriptions indicated that an eclipse would occur, what type it would be, solar or lunar, and roughly what time of day it would happen. A subsidiary dial within the Saros dial tracked a further 54-year cycle, called the exeligmos, to correct for the fact that the Saros repeats eclipses shifted by 8 hours each time. The back of the device also tracked the Olympiad cycle, the 4-year period between the Olympic Games and other Panhellenic athletic festivals. Names of specific festivals are inscribed on this section. A single input shaft on the side drove everything. You turned a hand crank. And every gear in the device moved in its correct proportion, every pointer advanced on its dial, the moon changed phase, the sun moved through the zodiac, and somewhere on the eclipse dial, if a predicted eclipse was approaching, the relevant inscription would come into view. And all of this was running simultaneously, driven by a single crank. Guys, I want to stop here for a moment. Because it's easy to describe all of this technically and lose the actual extraordinary quality of it. Let me try a comparison. The year is approximately 100 BCE. There are no printing presses. No eyeglasses. No paper in Europe. The most advanced metallurgical and engineering knowledge available in the Western world is being used to make weapons, agricultural tools, and large architectural structures. The dominant mechanical technologies are the lever, the pulley, the wheel, the arch. These are remarkable technologies. But gears, in the ancient world, were understood to be simple fixed ratio devices for watermills and cranes. And yet some workshop, somewhere in the Greek-speaking world, in or around the island of Rhodes if the inscriptions are a guide, designed and manufactured a device with at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, including epicyclic gears, gears mounted on other moving gears, of extraordinary precision. Gears with triangular teeth cut by hand to approximately 1 mm in length. Gears arranged in trains that compute astronomical ratios accurate to within fractions of a day across centuries. All enclosed in a portable wooden case. The next time anything of comparable mechanical sophistication appears in the historical record is medieval Europe. 1,400 years later. There is no surviving mechanism from the intervening centuries that suggests a continuous tradition. No transitional devices. No workshop records. No teaching texts on the manufacture of epicyclic gear trains. The technology appears in 100 BCE. Then there is silence. And then, more than 1,000 years later, medieval clockmakers in Europe and the Islamic world begin building comparably complex devices, apparently independently, without any documented knowledge of what the Greeks had already done. Something was lost. And we don't know exactly what, or how much of it. The mechanism sat in the Athens Museum, essentially ignored, for half a century after its discovery. The gear that Spiridon Stays noticed in 1902 prompted an initial study by his cousin Valerio Stays, who recognized it as a clock-like device. But the scholarly establishment of the early 20th century was reluctant to accept that ancient Greeks could have built anything this complex. The initial expert consensus was that the device must have been misdated, that it was a later medieval device that happened to be on the same ship. The alternative, that the ancient Greeks had built a mechanical computer, seemed too improbable to take seriously. It was not until the 1950s that a British science historian named Derek de Solla Price looked at the mechanism with the attention it deserved. Price's study, eventually published in full in 1974 as a paper titled Gears from the Greeks, was the first serious attempt to understand the mechanism's technical content. Price was the first to clearly articulate how far ahead of its time the device was. He called it a product of Greek genius, and said, "Nothing like this instrument is preserved elsewhere. Nothing comparable to it is known from any ancient scientific text or literary allusion." He was right on all counts. The real breakthroughs came in the 21st century, when imaging technology finally caught up with the mechanism's secrets. In 2005, the Antikythera Mechanism research project brought an extraordinary piece of equipment to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, an 8-ton custom-built X-ray tomography machine called the Blade Runner, built by a British company called X-Tech Systems and originally designed to inspect turbine blades for microscopic cracks. Operating at 450 kilovolts, the machine scanned the fragments at micron resolution, revealing the internal structure of the gears for the first time, and, far more significantly, revealing thousands of inscriptions on the inner surfaces of the fragments that had never been visible before. What the inscriptions revealed was an instruction manual. Someone had engraved, into the bronze surfaces of the mechanism itself, a detailed guide to its operation. The inscriptions named the dials. They described the functions. They named the planets. They identified specific eclipse predictions. More than 3,500 characters of ancient Greek text, hidden inside the corroded fragments, invisible for 2,000 years, finally readable. And in 2021, a team at University College London led by Tony Freeth, who has spent more than 2 decades studying the mechanism, published a paper proposing a complete model of the front display. Based on the newly deciphered inscriptions, Freeth's team reconstructed a front panel showing all 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the Sun, the Moon, and the lunar nodes that determine eclipse conditions, all moving simultaneously on their correct cycles, driven by the same single-hand crank. It is, in Freeth's words, almost unbelievable in its brilliance. Now, who built it? Nobody knows. The mechanism survives in 82 fragments, representing approximately a third of the original device. Much is missing. The manufacturer is not recorded. No other device like it has ever been found. No ancient text describes its construction. Archimedes, the genius of Syracuse who died in 212 BCE, is sometimes mentioned, because ancient sources describe him building mechanical devices of great sophistication, and because one version of the mechanism's date overlaps with the years immediately after his death. But there is no evidence linking Archimedes specifically to this device. The inscriptions suggest a connection to the calendar systems used in Epirus, in northwestern Greece, or on the island of Corfu. The astronomical theory most clearly encoded in the gears is associated with Hipparchus and the tradition of astronomical work on Rhodes. One tradition holds that the mechanism was made on Rhodes and was being transported to Rome, possibly as a gift or a commission, when the ship went down. But these are suggestions. Inferences from inscriptions and geographic associations. The person or workshop that designed and manufactured the Antikythera mechanism is unknown. Whether there were others like it, whether this was one of a kind or one of many, is unknown. Whether the knowledge to build it died with the workshop that made it, or survived in some form that simply hasn't been found, is unknown. What we know is this. The ship sank. The mechanism went to the bottom of the Aegean. It sat there for 2,000 years. A storm pushed a group of sponge divers to shelter at a small island. One of them went looking for sponges and found marble statues instead. And in the wreckage beside those statues was a lump of corroded bronze that turned out to be the most sophisticated mechanical device of the ancient world. A device that rewrote what we thought we knew about human technological capability. A device that proved ancient people were doing something we thought impossible, and then doing it so completely, so brilliantly, that when the knowledge was lost, it took the human species 14 centuries to find its way back. The fragments of the Antikythera Mechanism are in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. You can see them. You can look at the actual gears, the ones with the millimeter-long teeth, cut by hand, 2,000 years ago, through the museum glass. Divers have returned to the Antikythera wreck site multiple times since 1900. In the ongoing excavation, more fragments of the shipwreck continue to be found. In 2021, researchers recovered a human skull with significant DNA preservation, potentially identifiable with modern genomic analysis. The ship and its secrets are still giving up what they contain. And the mechanism itself is still being studied. Every new imaging technology, every new computational model, every new paper brings us slightly closer to understanding the full extent of what it could do. Each new finding, in the words of the researchers, reveals something more extraordinary than what was already known. The UCL team's 2021 model, if correct, shows a mechanism of breathtaking ambition, a portable cosmos, hand-cranked, showing the entire known solar system in motion, on a scale small enough to carry. In 100 BCE. Made of bronze. Cut by hand. By someone whose name we do not know. Okay guys. That is the story of the Antikythera Mechanism. The device that shouldn't exist. That a storm pulled from the sea. That sat ignored for 50 years. That has taken 120 years of increasingly sophisticated research to partially understand. And that still, despite everything we know, doesn't fully yield its secrets. I want to know what you think. Does the existence of this device change how you think about ancient history? About what we assume ancient people were and weren't capable of? And what do you make of the gap, the 1,400 years of silence after this device was made, when nothing comparable existed? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this video was worth your time, please hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Turn on notifications. And I'll see you in the next one.